I found myself sitting on my stepfather's lap, his gentle fingers trailing along my neck until I could barely breathe, trapped between a thrill and a deep, unnameable fear. In that moment, he whispered something into my ear that sent a shiver through my entire being, marking the point when everything irrevocably changed. I was 10 when my father passed away from a heart attack. One moment he was there, and the next, he was gone, an instant that shattered our entire family. The silence that followed in our home became a constant reminder of our loss, leaving nothing ever the same again. My mother's reaction was immediate and drastic. At first, her tears flowed endlessly, filling the quiet nights with sorrow. Soon, however, her weeping morphed into a different kind of pain. She began to drink. Initially, it was just a few sips in the evenings after dinner, but as the weeks passed, her drinking grew overt, and any sense of shame disappeared. Watching her pour another glass, I saw her behavior become increasingly erratic. Every small noise or comment, from my voice and footsteps to even my school grades, seemed to set her off. I was no longer seen as a child to be sheltered. Instead, I was a constant reminder of a happier past that was now forever lost. Tension built up in our home, and I quickly learned that any request for comfort or help would be met with anger or dismissal. By the age of 12, I realized I had to take charge. I started handling household chores that no one else would, learning to cook simple meals from whatever I could find in the pantry. It wasn't about passion for cooking, it was about survival. Chopping vegetables and stirring pots became tasks that propelled me forward, away from the oppressive silence and explosive outbursts at home. When I turned 13, I began earning money on my own. I took on small jobs in the neighborhood, running errands and doing odd tasks for neighbors in need. Each job was a quick transaction with no unnecessary conversation, just work and immediate payment. I learned to count every dollar and plan my expenses carefully. This newfound responsibility meant I could no longer depend on anyone to keep me afloat. I had to be resourceful and swift. By 14, I had made an irrevocable decision. I learned not to expect help from anyone. I made it clear to myself and to those around me that I was alone in this fight. Every setback was met with a steely resolve to overcome it. I walked to school without ever glancing back at the broken house I had left behind. Each morning, I followed my own routine, tackling every problem in my own way. Yet, even as I managed these new responsibilities, the memory of that fateful encounter with the man who had both thrilled and terrified me lingered. It marked the beginning of my realization that life was not about waiting for rescue. I was forced to learn the hard truth. Nothing was given freely, and every advantage came at a price. The intimacy of that moment clashed with the harsh reality of my daily existence. It was a stark reminder that even in closeness, danger could lurk behind every gesture. The experience taught me that people could be unpredictable. I saw how swiftly circumstances could change. His whispered words had ignited a chain of events I could neither control nor fully understand. They set in motion a transformation in me, a transformation where I refused to remain passive. Every day became a mission, whether it was earning money to keep the lights on or dodging another confrontation with my mother's broken temper. I was determined to survive and thrive even as my world crumbled around me. The environment was harsh and unforgiving, and every moment in that deteriorating house was a test. I learned to act swiftly, never hesitating to leave a room if the atmosphere turned volatile. My decisions were made solely on practicality, on the immediate need to keep moving forward. There was no time for elaborate plans or hesitation, only the next step, finding food, money, or a safe haven. Every action was a matter of survival. I had no room for doubt or fear. The past was a closed chapter, and every new challenge demanded immediate action. That night, I resolved that nothing, no matter how dangerous or unsettling, would stop me from taking control of my life. At 14, I had learned the most important lesson of all. I could not depend on anyone but myself. At 15, my mother introduced me to Daniel. He was 46 and, at first, seemed right. With a pleasant smile, he gave me books and asked for my opinions about the world. I was used to adults ignoring me or treating me as a child, but Daniel spoke to me as an equal. He first appeared on an ordinary Tuesday evening. My mother had already settled into her usual pattern of drinking amid the stale odor of alcohol and simmering tension. When I heard the door open, I paused my homework and braced myself for another round of my mother's outbursts. Instead, a calm, steady presence filled the room. Daniel greeted me with a nod and a simple, "Hi, I'm Daniel." His voice was firm yet friendly, and his eyes held a focus that made me feel unexpectedly important. That evening, while my mother muttered under her breath and sipped from her glass, Daniel took charge of dinner. He moved efficiently around the cramped kitchen, setting the table, preparing the meal, without fuss. I watched him as he chopped vegetables and stirred a boiling pot. His actions were deliberate and precise. There was no pretense or overbearing concern, he was simply there, doing what needed to be done. After dinner, Daniel sat with me in the kitchen. He asked about my day and listened intently as I recounted school assignments and small challenges. "What do you think about the issues we face today?" he asked one night, leaning forward slightly. I hesitated. Most adults either overlooked my opinions or dismissed them outright. With Daniel, however, I found myself speaking more freely. He never rushed me, letting me finish my thoughts before offering his perspective. Over the following weeks, Daniel became a consistent part of our daily routine. Every evening around 6, he arrived with groceries and sometimes a couple of books he thought might interest me. Unlike others in my life, he made an effort to engage in meaningful conversation rather than talking down to me. One night, as we cleared the table together, he said, "You're very smart. I think you'll grow into an incredible woman." His compliment was direct and unembellished, far from patronizing. Despite my appreciation, I couldn't shake a subtle conflict. A man nearly 3 decades older than me showing such focused attention was unsettling in a way I couldn't articulate. I questioned his motives, even as I clung to the comfort his presence provided. His interest, though kind, stirred doubts about the boundaries between us. I kept those thoughts to myself, choosing instead to focus on the pleasant routines he introduced. One evening, after dinner had been cleaned up and my mother had long since retreated to her room, Daniel and I sat at the kitchen table discussing a book he had just given me. "Think about your future," he said matter-of-factly yet encouragingly. "You have potential beyond what you see right now." His words felt like a challenge, a prompt to look past the limitations imposed by my home life and consider a different path. I nodded, absorbing his advice, while also feeling the weight of responsibility settle on my young shoulders. Daniel's presence brought calm order to the chaos of my daily life. He didn't try to replace my mother or solve her problems. He simply created moments where I could feel heard and valued. Even as my mother's drinking worsened, our conversations provided a brief escape from the constant tension. When Daniel mentioned plans to take me to a local bookstore next week, it was more than just an outing, it was a hint of a world beyond the suffocating walls of our home. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the day's events with cautious optimism, mingled with uncertainty about what trusting Daniel might mean in the long run. Every conversation with him left me with more questions than answers, yet for the first time in a long while, I felt someone was investing in my future. At 17, everything changed. My mother's alcoholism had reached its peak, and one morning, after a particularly violent outburst, she was taken to a rehabilitation clinic without warning. The house fell silent. The usual chaos was replaced by a heavy emptiness. I was left with Daniel. Standing in the doorway as the ambulance drove away, his expression was unreadable for a moment before he broke the silence. "Everything will be fine." His tone was firm yet gentle, his words echoing in the now empty hallway. Yet, I couldn't shake the uncertainty they stirred within me. In the following days, the house felt surreal without my mother's constant presence, without her angry outbursts, her tears, the clinking of empty bottles. There was only Daniel and me. Mornings began with the steady sound of the coffee maker. Daniel made it a point to brew fresh coffee each morning, a small ritual that somehow restored structure to the day. I would sit at the table, the aroma filling the room, while Daniel asked, "How was your day?" Even on days when I couldn't pinpoint a single positive moment, he tried to fill the void. On holidays and special occasions, he would come home with a small box of chocolates or a book he thought might interest me. These simple gestures made the long, quiet evenings a bit more bearable. Yet, as days passed, I couldn't help noticing that sometimes his gaze lingered on me longer than it should. Those moments were brief, a soft, almost questioning look in his eyes, as if he were searching for something beyond simple concern for my well-being. I wasn't sure how to interpret those glances. They left me both intrigued and uneasy. Our routine soon became the only constant in my life. I attended school and returned to a quiet house where Daniel and I existed in a fragile equilibrium. He handled the mundane tasks, cooking dinner, cleaning up, paying the bills, while I took on more responsibility than ever before. Despite the apparent normalcy of our daily routine, an undercurrent of tension persisted. One late afternoon, as I sat in the living room reading a book Daniel had given me, he entered quietly from the kitchen. Pausing at the doorway to watch me read, he then cleared his throat. "You've been quiet today," he remarked casually, as if commenting on the weather. I looked up, noticing again the unusual look in his eyes, and simply replied, "Just thinking," offering no further explanation. He nodded slowly and left the room, leaving behind a lingering silence that felt heavier than usual. On weekends, the atmosphere shifted subtly. Daniel and I sometimes took walks around the neighborhood, brief escapes from the isolation of our home, a taste of everyday normalcy. Yet, during these walks, his conversation often veered into deeply personal territory. He would ask about my future, my dreams, and the kind of life I wanted beyond our current existence. At first, his questions felt supportive, but over time they began to feel invasive. I started to wonder if his interest was entirely benign or if there was an ulterior motive behind every question and every gesture. One chilly evening, as the wind rattled the window panes, I found myself alone with Daniel in the living room again. The silence was punctuated only by the ticking of a clock on the wall. Sitting on the edge of the sofa, his eyes fixed on me longer than usual, he said softly, "You're doing well." I nodded, my mind racing with conflicting emotions, gratitude for his support, uncertainty about his intentions, and the overwhelming pressure of a future that suddenly seemed to rest in his hands. In that moment, the simplicity of our routine clashed with the complexity of our situation. I was alone with Daniel in a house that felt both safe and confining, a place where every small gesture carried hidden weight. The future was uncertain, and I wasn't sure if I was ready to confront the deeper implications of his presence in my life. When I turned 18, my mother was still in the hospital. One evening after my birthday, we sat on the sofa in the living room, a space that had become our shared refuge. Dimly lit by a single lamp, the quiet was broken only by the soft hum of the heater. Daniel had made himself comfortable at one end of the sofa while I sat on the other, still trying to process the rapid changes of the past few years. Reaching over to a small table beside us, he poured a measure of whiskey into 2 glasses and asked, "Do you want some whiskey?" His tone was casual, yet the question carried an underlying tension. I paused for a moment, then laughed softly. "You're tempting me," I replied, my words feeling lighter than the situation warranted. My laughter was brief, and I caught a flicker in his eyes, a mixture of amusement and something else I couldn't quite place. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he fixed his gaze on me. After what felt like an eternity, he said slowly, "Elise," deliberately drawing out my name with a weight and sincerity that demanded attention. My breath caught as I waited for him to continue. "I wanted you to grow up so that it would be right," he said, simple, direct, and authoritative, leaving little room for misunderstanding. The room seemed to narrow, and every sound faded as I struggled to comprehend his meaning. My heart began to race, torn between laughing off his remark and letting the gravity of his confession settle in. I managed to whisper, I don't know what to say." Daniel remained silent for a moment, his tone measured yet edged with longing and resignation. "Say nothing if you're not ready," he finally said. There was an unmistakable edge in his voice, a mix of yearning and resignation. "I need you to know I've kept these feelings hidden for too long, waiting for the right moment when everything would seem right." I recalled the countless evenings we had spent together, the many times he had offered a kind word or a small token of care. Now those moments took on a new meaning. They were no longer just gestures of support, they were the building blocks of something far more complicated. My mind raced back to the days when my mother's absence had forced me to rely solely on Daniel, when every small kindness felt like a lifeline in a turbulent sea. The silence stretched on as I considered everything he had said. I knew that, from this moment forward, our relationship would change irrevocably. I could see both hope and uncertainty in his eyes, a future we were both forced to confront. In that quiet living room, with the soft glow of the lamp and the lingering aroma of whiskey, the weight of his confession pressed down on us both. I swallowed hard and took a slow sip from my glass. "I need time to think," I finally said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside. Daniel nodded, understanding my unspoken request for space. He stood up and moved to the window, gazing out into the night as if searching for answers among the city lights. I remained on the sofa, the room now filled with a silence heavier than before. In that moment, I realized that the next steps in our lives would require decisions neither of us was fully prepared to make. One evening, everything shifted. We were in Daniel's room, a space dimly lit by flickering candles and filled with the soft strains of music that seemed to underscore every heartbeat. The ambience was intimate, designed to dissolve any lingering hesitation. Daniel's presence was both commanding and reassuring. His hands rested confidently on my shoulders, guiding me through an experience that was tender yet intense. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. I found myself sitting on his lap, the closeness blurring the lines between desire and uncertainty. His fingers traced slowly along my neck, each touch igniting a fire within me. In that moment, I lost track of whether I was gasping for air out of excitement or fear. It was impossible to tell. Just as everything seemed to build toward an inevitable climax, a wave of panic crashed over me. I froze, my heart thundering in my chest as reality invaded the haze of passion. I searched his eyes for reassurance, but instead saw something that made my skin crawl, a look that revealed this wasn't just about intimacy, but about control, expectation, and an imbalance I could no longer ignore. Suddenly, the brutal truth struck me. It was all wrong. Not because I didn't love him, I did feel a deep connection, but because what we were doing was unjust. It wasn't about a lack of love. It was about fairness and the honesty of our bond. I realized that Daniel wasn't with me for who I truly was. He was with me because I had outgrown my childhood, a fact that twisted our connection into something unequal, something tainted by inherent injustice. My pulse raced as I pulled away. "I can't," I whispered, my voice trembling with regret and resolve. The words hung stark and final in the charged air. His face shifted instantly, a flash of hurt crossing his features as he tried to comprehend what I had just said. "I can't, Daniel," I managed, struggling to articulate the surge of emotion and reason that had overwhelmed me. I stood up quickly, hands shaking as I gathered my clothes and moved with an urgency born of desperation. Every second felt critical, as if lingering any longer would seal my fate. "Elise, wait." Daniel's voice trailed after me, desperate and pleading. But I knew deep down that if I stayed, I would never reclaim myself entirely. That realization hit me like a jolt, reinforcing the decision that had crystallized in my mind. The following morning, before the first light broke through the darkness, I packed my belongings and left. Every step away from that house felt like reclaiming my autonomy, a decisive move toward a future that belonged solely to me. Now, at 20, I live in another city with a new life waiting. I have built routines, forged new friendships, and found a stability I once believed was unattainable. Yet, the past remains a persistent echo in the quiet moments of the night. In the stillness, when the world sleeps and everything is stripped to its simplest form, memories of Daniel invade my solitude. I recall the sound of his voice, the warmth of his touch, and the unmistakable look in his eyes, a mix of surprise and pain that I hadn't fully understood until it was too late. Those recollections surge through me late at night, stirring questions I cannot easily dismiss. Amid the quiet of my new life, I often wonder, does he still wait for me? I lie awake, the hum of the city a distant murmur, replaying that fateful night, the flickering candlelight, the soft music, and the moment his hands traced my neck. Each memory is layered with the weight of what was lost. It is not merely regret or longing that I feel, but a profound questioning of what might have been if things had been different. The more I reflect, the more I realize that the decision I made was both a betrayal of a cherished connection and a necessary step towards self-preservation, a brutal, yet vital, awakening to the truth that some bonds are built on unequal ground. I had allowed myself to be swept away by the allure of feeling special, of escaping the isolation and pain of my earlier years, only to find that the price was far too high. As the night deepens, the tension between past and present blurs, leaving me with an endless stream of questions. Can true connection exist when it's tainted by imbalance? Will Daniel's yearning ever fade, or does he still harbor hope for something more? These questions haunt me, making it impossible to fully settle into my new life. And so, as I drift between sleep and wakefulness, I cannot help but wonder, does he still wait for me? Now, as I sit here reflecting on the tangled threads of my past, I realize that the scars left behind are both a reminder of my survival and a testament to my strength. In the years since that tumultuous time, I have slowly learned to piece together the fragments of a life once marred by neglect and manipulation. Every step I took away from that oppressive environment was an act of reclaiming a future that was rightfully mine, a future where the echoes of my former life no longer dictated my every decision. I built a world for myself where the weight of memory was balanced by the promise of tomorrow. I discovered new passions, forged relationships that nurtured rather than harmed, and began to understand that forgiveness, both for myself and for those who had once hurt me, was essential for true healing. Yet, even as I embraced these new beginnings, the past lingered like a shadow. At night, in the quiet moments before sleep, I still found myself wondering about the choices I had made and the bonds I had once believed were unbreakable. The conflicting emotions of sorrow, regret, and even a faint, lingering affection would sometimes rise unbidden, challenging the resolve I had fought so hard to build. But with each sunrise, I grew a little more certain that my path was my own to walk. I learned to treasure the small victories, a kind word from a stranger, the comfort of a warm cup of tea, the simple joy of a day unburdened by old ghosts. I understood that while the past could never be rewritten, it could serve as a powerful reminder of the lessons learned and the person I had become. Now, standing at the threshold of a life defined not by past traumas but by hope and self-determination, I accept that uncertainty is part of the journey. The memories of those tumultuous days remain, not as chains that bind me, but as faded imprints on the canvas of my soul, a canvas I continue to paint with the vibrant colors of resilience, love, and the unwavering belief that I deserve a life filled with peace and possibility.